So friends, we will continue our discussion on previous year's questions analysis of Civil Services main examination, GS paper 1, the questions on history and culture, right? So friends, today we will take up a discussion on the cultural contribution of the Guptas and Cholas. It's actually an interesting trend that started by UPSC in the mains in a way. In 2022, they have asked this question. You know, generally previous years, if you see the general studies, other years, if you see the questions, there are questions on cultural contribution of different sectors like Cholas or whatever. But combining two very important segments, that is Guptas and Cholas, is an interesting trend. These are actually called tag questions. So you might have read a lot about the Guptan art and architecture, the literature, cultural contribution, we'll come back to that, and also about Cholas. But say in 250 words, how do you write this both? So what we are going to do is, we'll see how do you present your answer if this question, this kind of questions are coming again, and also individually we will see a bit of details on Guptan cultural contribution and Cholas in detail. So it is very much likely that you might expect them again. They might ask about Cholas art and architectural features or Guptan cultural contribution, Guptan art and architecture, temple architecture of the Guptas, like that. Let us see that. So the 2022 question, last year's question on contribution of the Guptas. I hope you are able to see. Contribution of the Guptas and Cholas to Indian heritage and culture. This is the question. Okay. Now it's a very interesting thing, because they asked the Guptan culture, which is the hallmark of North Indian development. As you know, Guptas, other than the conquest, we don't have much of a Guptan presence. Samudragupta's time, where he had the South Indian conquest as mentioned in the Allahabad inscription, the Dakshinapatha, we don't have much of the Guptan artifacts in the South India, right? Whereas, of course, you see the Dasavatara temple and others, they are up to Maharashtra, Devagiri or Deoghar. But beyond that, we don't have any great contribution of Guptan art and architecture here, though Indian culture as a whole was broadly influenced by them. The temple architecture in the south is actually influenced by the Guptas, the rectangular temple. So now see, they have combined two important aspects of the pan-Indian Guptan culture as we see in the North India, and the very lofty cultural contribution of the Cholas in the south. So how do you write the first sentence? The first sentence, you capture the importance of the Guptas and the Cholas. Now Guptas and Cholas represent very significant cultural phase in Indian history and culture, Indian heritage and culture, because Guptan cultural contribution is actually the mainstay of a series of developments that came later. Now say, what is the Guptan cultural contribution? Let us see briefly. Anyway, you have to write briefly only in the examination. One is, you see the temple architecture, the Hindu temple construction, the Hindu temple architecture has began with the Guptas in North India, right? The main contribution is evolution of the rectangular temple design. And friends, this rectangular temple design has become the mainstay of temples. Subsequently, if you see in the Deccan or Vesara style of the Chalukyas, we have the advent of North Indian style of temple in Pattadakal. You see in Pattadakal we have major 10 temples, 6 in southern style and 4 in northern style. So the Maharashtra is a very important area, because Guptas ruled up to Maharashtra predominantly. We have their direct influence. The Dasavatara temple reflects this. And we have Chalukyas who are also ruling from Maharashtra, Andhra and Karnataka regions. So the influence extending from Maharashtra, you see the influence of North Indian temple architecture to south that was brought. So in a way, the Guptan temple innovation in the form of North Indian rectangular temple architecture provided the fulcrum or basis for the South Indian temple architecture variation by introducing the rectangular style. We don't have rectangular style of temples in South India before Guptas. In the Ikshwaku times in the south, there are some temples, of course, in Andhra region, but the real rectangular temple was from the Guptan period onwards, and here in the northern style we see in the Chalukyan architecture, Deccan or Vesara. So Chalukyas and Pallavas is South Indian predominant architecture, and here we had the early Dravidian. Pallava architecture is called early Dravidian, whereas Cholas represents the mature Dravidian. So anyway, one important contribution of the Guptas is the temple architecture. The temple architecture began, the Hindu temple architecture began with the Guptas, which was picked up by South Indian temples later. You know, by Chalukyan time it came up to south, and by Chola time it was completely provided or influenced the Dravidian style of architecture. All temples later were rectangular temples. All major temples in India are rectangular temple, whether rectangular design, whether you see the Brihadeshwaraya temple or even you see Vijayanagara temple later, any big temple later, they are rectangular. So one important cultural contribution to Indian heritage and culture is the temple architecture, rectangular temple. Then subsequent cultural contribution is the great development of literature, Sanskrit literature. This you see both in secular as well as non-secular. This is how you need to write. The contribution is both secular and non-secular, right? Secular, you see the whole kind of developments, whether it is, religious, whether it is Panchatantra of Vishnu Sharma, whether it is Dravya Pariksha by Thakkar Veru, which is a very important text for alchemy, and whether it is, Aryabhattiyam by Aryabhatta, that is also a very, very important thing where the basis of zero and decimal system, the astronomical things were there. Varaha Mira's Brihad Jataka, Brahmagupta's gravitation theory, Shushruta and Charaka's treatises on health and medicine, Charaka Samhita, Shushruta Samhita. So this come under secular as well as S&T related literature. Kalidas plays are also Megha Sandesam, for example, is a secular play, whereas Abhijnana Shakuntal and others have some kind of religious basis for it. So friends, you have a time limit there. There is a challenge. So predominantly secular religious Sanskrit literature has developed very well. Then religious literature, see you have Dharma, the epics, Itihasas, Ramayana and Mahabharata got their final shape at this point of time in the religious literature. Then Astadasa Puranas, 18 Puranas got their final shape. Puranas, the writing of Puranas has started in the post-Mauryan period, but then it picked up completed by the Guptan period. Whatever Ramayana and Mahabharata we read today, whatever Puranas we have today are actually got their final shape during Guptan period. Bhagavad Gita was also added to Mahabharata at this point of time. So religious literature is also very, very important. Similarly, we have some of the Buddhist texts, Sukhavati Vyuha, Karanda Vyuha. These are Mahayana Buddhist texts which are attributable to Guptan period. Mahayanism, which came up in the 1st century AD after division of Buddhism and Jainism, greatly developed during Guptan period, and it produced a lot of Mahayana Buddhist literature at this point of time. So this is about the religious literature, mainly you have to remember. Then the next important contribution of the Guptas is actually, the kind of, the popular culture that Guptan has brought in. You see the popular culture in the sense that, all the temple building activity and other aspects of the Guptas are basically by the people. They are driven by the people. If you see Guptan temples which are at Bhumra, Nachanakurta, then Deogar, these are not constructed by the kings actually. Whereas Mauryan temples, for example, Mauryan architecture is called royal architecture or art from the above, whereas Guptan is called popular culture. Then of course in this you also can add education. Whether the university developments, Nalanda University or the Gatikas have become good contribution during the Guptas. So this is the basic 4-5 points you can write about the Guptan contribution. Then you come to Cholas. You link it up. If this kind of questions come, you will have to link it up both. Now what are the contribution of the Cholas? Again, basically mainly the art and architecture. Cholas contribution to art and architecture is very huge, in the sense that their structural elements, their structural style represent the final maturity of the Dravidian style of architecture. Pallavas had the early Dravidian style. Both are technically called Dravidian only, but Pallavas had early Dravidian style where they had monolithic architecture. We don't have much structural temples during the Pallavan time. We have pagodas, we have sculpture, we have monolithic temples, we have shore temples, but predominantly the massive structural temples, as we see in places like Bradishwaralaya at Tanjavur, you see Kapaleshwarala temple at Chennai, you see temples at Chidambaram, you see other temples at Narthamalai. All these were predominantly during the Chola period. So the Chola contribution to temple architecture, the evolution, it is actually the maturity of the Dravidian model. What do we mean by Dravidian model? One is the rectangular temples of the Cholas. Second, there is a addition of a mandapa to a temple which represented the increase in temple based activity. Pradakshina pada, an integrated Pradakshina pada which started for the first time during the Chola constructions. That is one of the features of Dravidian. You see North Indian Nagara style of temples don't have integrated Pradakshina pada. For example, you see the main temple of Kasi, you just not before the renovation I am talking, people used to roam around outside. But South Indian temples have an integrated Pradakshina pada. If this is the sanctum sanctorium and here is the idol, in the same group we have an integrated Pradakshina pada. This is one very important aspect of the Dravidian architecture. And of course, idols or sculptures decorating the temples, it's like sculptural developments, sculptural aspects like, the idols of the king and queen who constructed these temples. Then we have Alvars and Nayanars who are kept in these temples. Then painting, very rich murals or frescoes on the walls and the ceilings of the temple. So these are all the architectural contribution, So, and of course, going beyond cultural aspects, Cholas also contributed to the great paintings. For example, if you see Sittanavasal caves have some of the Cholas murals. So art and architecture, Tamil literature also developed very well, Tamil language developed very well during the time. So if you see the cultural contribution of these two, they represent a very, very significant phase. It was based on the Guptan cultural contribution that subsequent pan-Indian culture has developed. And friends, whatever the predominant element of Hindu culture or Indian culture today, again we see that the lot of takeaways from the Guptan culture, it provided the basis. Similarly, as the South Indian culture, the temple architecture, this represented the peak. In fact, after Cholas, the massive temples were again built by Vijayanagara on the basis of this Vijayanagara art and architecture. After that, we don't have any great temple building activity that was done to this level of activity. Okay, so these two represent a very important phases in Indian cultural and heritage with implications, vast implications for the future. That is how you need to write. You can prepare for these two questions, whether individually or combinedly. General expectation was that either they would ask about Guptas or Cholas. This is the first time that they combined both. So friends, be prepared for tag questions. If there is a tag question, you need to identify what are the topmost points taken from one segment, here from the Guptas, for example, like this, then the Cholas. So presenting in a crisp manner in 250 words becomes a challenge. Don't write too much on Guptas, don't write too much on Cholas. Try to balance out in the most important aspects. So this is another one. We will take up the next question of previous year's analysis again later. Thank you.